The last time we met, we covered a lot of ground in Acts. This time, we're going to cover a lot of water. Since Homer's The Odyssey, people have loved nautical stories. Sea voyages are found all throughout history, and we're entering into a time frame here where they are immensely popular. And I find it fascinating that Luke records for us one of the most detailed accounts of the working of an ancient ship in the whole of classical literature. This passage, by the way, will help us get through the storms of life. Now look, I didn't like that. I was studying this week, and I'm like, Lord, I don't want to preach a sermon on getting through the storms of life. How cliche is that? You know, it's just not intelligent enough for me. Then I heard Tim Keller, New York City's Yoda, say when he was preaching this text, the purpose of this chapter is all about dealing with the storms of life. So then I started to reconsider, my prejudices there. And finally, I arrived at this conclusion. I think that is the purpose. The metaphor of storms can be found all throughout the Bible. And the purpose of storms in the Bible is to show us how to serve Jesus when times get tough. Now, there are three different types of storms. Satan can use these storms for his purposes, or God can override them and use these storms for his purposes. So there are common storms. This is simply the result of our fallenness, disease, aches, pains. A funeral service is a constant and common reminder that we are a fallen race. So there are common storms. Then there are corrective storms. This is when God disciplines us, believers, for disobedience. You find that clearly in Hebrews chapter 12. It's like, Kyle, how do I know if this storm is because of my sin? You will know. When I spank my kids, I don't say, now go figure out what that's for. And when you're disciplined by the Lord, you will know if it's because of your sin or not. Common storms, corrective storms, and then finally constructive storms. These storms produce perseverance and spiritual maturity, as James chapter 1 unpacks for us. So here's what I want to do today. I want to sail through Acts chapters 27 and 28 without drowning you. So if you come out alive, then I'm counting it a success today. I thought about preaching with a patch over my eye and a Jack Sparrow hat on, but I decided against it. My wife says it's not a good idea. Sometimes I feel like Jack Sparrow, but with better teeth and a receding hairline. Listen, I've lost it already today. But there's a promise in this text that Paul told them, not one hair of your head, will be harmed. And I was praying this week, Lord, I'd love for you to say that to me, because they're going away quickly. Now look, chapter 27 opens up with Paul being transported by ship to Rome on some trumped up charges. They were false accusations. And he's going to make a few stops, and you may be wondering, is he stopping by Atlanta? All flights go through Atlanta. I don't think so. The rapture, I think, will go through Atlanta. But Paul's trip to Rome doesn't go through Atlanta. So I brought a map. I want you to see exactly where his trips, what cities they hit. Now, let's throw up the picture of the map. There are 3 ships in the story, and I'll show you 2 right out of the gate, and then I'll show you the third one once we get to chapter 28. The first one, it's a big old long word. I just summarize it to say AD. If you want to know how to say it, Dr. Porter said it correctly. Paul sails the AD on the Mediterranean Sea. Now, many people book cruises on the Mediterranean Sea. How many of you have been on a cruise before? Would you raise your hand? All right. How many of you have been on the cruise in the last week? Would you raise your hand? Last 2 weeks? I saw you guys on the cruise. I heard about it. That's excellent. Cruises are relaxing. They're beautiful, especially cruises on the Mediterranean Sea. The cities along the coast are fascinating, just packed with historical significance. However, Paul wasn't on a cruise ship. Sarah and I have been on a couple cruise ships, and my hairline starts growing the opposite way. And it starts going this way when I'm on a cruise. Free food. It's wonderful. But Paul wasn't setting sail on a cruise ship. He was on a coastal vessel. Small coastal vessel. And I want you to see, he leaves Caesarea, goes to Sidon, and then goes to Myra. In Myra, the Roman guards transport Paul onto the Alexandrian. Now, this is not a pirate ship. They didn't welcome Paul onto the ship and say, "Welcome to the Black Pearl." They didn't say that at all. This was actually more like a cargo ship carrying grain. Think a freight vessel. So they go from Myra to Fair Havens. And then in verse 9 of chapter 27, it gives us a chronological clue to when they landed. The text mentions that the fast was already over. Now that's referencing the Day of Atonement. In other words, the winter is approaching and it's cold. The weather is turning surly, and it's time to settle in at Fair Havens and not to be sailing around the Mediterranean. This was the dangerous season for sailing. So Paul's on this ship. He pipes up and he says to the 276 passengers, especially the crewmen and the guards, he says, look, we can't complete the voyage to Italy. We have to winter here. And Paul knew what he was talking about. He had seaman's legs. He wasn't a novice. Scholars have cataloged Paul's 11 voyages on this Mediterranean before this one. Paul had already been through 3 shipwrecks according to 2 Corinthians chapter 11 before this one. Paul was a traveling guru. I've kind of felt like Paul traveling a lot for the last month. My wife in the back there, we went to South Korea and back 2 times. I can't give you any advice about the sea, but I can give you some advice about the air. If you are flying American Airlines, you will be delayed. I promise you, you will be delayed. Now look, Paul was giving similar advice. And I use the word advice because I don't think he was giving a word of prophecy here. He's giving a word of advice. He's saying, hey guys, we're hauling this grain, all this frosted flakes. We're going to lose it all. We're going to lose our lives. We're going to lose everything. If you make this stupid decision to set sail during the rough seasons. Now, we encounter some storms because we make stupid decisions. How many of you have ever made a stupid decision? Would you raise your hand? All right. How many of you, you're married and your spouse has made a stupid decision? Would you raise your hand? Okay, first service, only one person. And then she was self-conscious. He's like, what is this? This service is more honest. Everyone raised their hand. That's good. So, sometimes we make stupid decisions. Let me give you 2 that are found in the text. One's an unwillingness to wait. Paul says, let's wait until after winter. They said, not a chance. Now is our opportunity. Let's make a run for it. Now, maybe you've heard those voices that say to you, you've got to hurry. You've got to make the decision now. Don't wait. You'll never have this opportunity again. You must always remember, Satan shoves you, but God leads you. Satan is like a salesman who says, if you don't buy it now, you're going to lose it. Somebody's coming right after. I think we have a problem, not with impulse buying, but with impulse living. We're just consistently, it's a whole generation of people that don't have the discipline enough to delay pleasure. Paul says, stay. The captain and the crew said, go. So they set sail. Now here's the second stupid decision, a desire for comfort. You find it in chapter 27, verse 12. Evidently, Fair Havens was not so fair, and it wasn't quite a safe haven for them. It was a crummy little port village with very little to do all winter. And this crew had a desire for comfort. And they said, okay, let's leave and let's try to go to Phoenix and let's winter in Phoenix. Paul's like, bad idea. Don't go to Phoenix. It's hot there. The basketball team is terrible. They only eat kale salad. Don't go to Phoenix. They didn't listen to him. They set sail for Phoenix. But when they set sail, they never reached Phoenix. They encountered a storm that pushed them out to sea. And this storm came with hurricane winds and pounding rain. The rolling clouds darkened the entire sky. And they couldn't see the stars. And the stars were their GPS. They didn't have Siri. That's how they determined their direction. And the storm was actually more than a hurricane, because the Greek word there is where we get our English word typhoon. So they were in a typhoon. They lost control of the vessel, and they were drifting helplessly across the Adriatic. And they threw some anchors out, not to stop the ship, but to slow the drift down. They were so worried that they didn't even eat for 14 days. Nothing stresses me out to miss a meal. It will not do it. Can you imagine how stressed they were? They missed 14 days of eating. Now, some storms come into your life because it's your fault. And I want to show you that from chapter 27, verse 21. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. You see, these sailors were in the storm because it was their fault. And sometimes storms come into our lives because it's our fault. However, sometimes storms come into our lives that are not a result of our sin, like Paul. This storm was not a result of his sin. So what is God doing when those storms come into your life? It's like the age-old question, why do bad things happen to me? Well, I think there's two reasons. There's a general purpose and a specific purpose. The general purpose is for your good. We could find that from the Old Testament life of Joseph. 12 boys living in a house, but the father had his favorite. The family was a mess because favoritism does that. The older boys grew up bitter, hard, and angry. One day they sold their brother into slavery and told the dad, Mufasa from the Lion King, came and killed him. Later, Joseph rose to prominence in Egypt, saved his family, looked his brothers in the eyes, and he said this statement, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." Bunch of terrible storms in Joseph's life, and he can look back and say, but God meant it for good. Paul, the same one who's going through this storm, says in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, all things work together for, you finish it, good. For good. He does not say all things are good. So you can look at this from the Joseph example or the Jesus example. A year or two before Jesus died, sickness was basically banished in Palestine. They love this Jesus character. And then all of a sudden, he's hanging from a cross. What good could come from this? Look at all the people that he healed locally. Well, God meant it for good. Because God's not just interested in local healing, he's interested in global healing. And Jesus promises to come back and banish all sickness and death. So there's a general purpose for storms, and that is for your good. Then there's a specific purpose, that's for your godliness. God is doing it for your godliness. Why did God allow Satan to rough up the waters? Why not send an angel to still the waters? Why not stop the storm? Why not protect the boat? Somebody worked hard on that boat, and now it's destroyed. Why not only allow sunshine and smooth waters? There are some preachers that will tell you that's what God desires. That's all he wants in your life is sunshine and smooth waters. They even have their own Bible versions with verses like this. If anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of puppies and pancakes. It'd be nice if it was true, right? But that's just not how God works. Imagine all the inconveniences that God allowed Paul to go through. And for what purpose? You see, I think we are far more too interested in getting to Rome, and God is more interested in who we will be when we get there. Some of you right now are in a health storm, a financial storm, or circumstantial storm. I want you to hear me. God sends storms in grace for your good and for your godliness. The lesson of Christianity, for those of you that are not believers, and we have a lot at every service, the lesson of Christianity is that while we want the Lord to deliver us, he wants to develop us. God is doing something. I want you to see this storm in chapter 27, verse 18. Imagine sitting in this. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, this is what I want you to grasp. All hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Why does God command us to go through hard stuff? Sarah and I just adopted. People often think there's elevator music playing in the background with people that adopted. You know, they picture this. Oh, happy day. It's just everywhere we go. You know, it's just that background music. And then the sister act choir joins in, singing back up. Oh, happy day. Look, there's music, but it's different music. It's more like everybody was kung fu fighting. And we have our own little South Korean Jackie Chan roundhouse kicking people now. But someone whispers to me, did you ever question on the plane if you were supposed to adopt or not in your sleep-deprived state? I'm like, did I ever question? Man, I questioned my salvation, my existence. If I was really a Tar Heel fan, I questioned everything. Look, when you're sleep-deprived, and some of you are, bags under your eyes, hard to concentrate, it's just like you're living in a constant fog, hard to even carry on a conversation. But when you're in those states, realize that life will sling some things at you, and you will feel like all hope is lost. You'll be like people in this ship. Lost your bearings, lost your appetite, lost your smile. You will get to points in your life, if you haven't been there yet, and you will ask, can I survive this? Some of you have been through difficult storms now. Lost your husband this week. I was just thinking about that. There's hope. There's anchors that can steady the soul in the darkest storms. Hebrews chapter 6, verse 19 says, we have the sure and steadfast anchor of the soul. So here's how I want to approach chapter 27. I want to give you 5 anchors that will steady your soul. Here's anchor number 1, the presence of God. You have to realize that going through storms will not necessarily make you a better person or make you more spiritual. Some people go through suffering and they come out bitter, and they're never the same. There's an old saying, the same sun that bakes bricks melts clay. The same experience can make someone and break someone else. So how is it that Paul can come through his storm better off instead of worse off? Only by one way. He's practicing the presence of God in the storm. When you do that, you will find that when storms hit you, it may knock you off balance, but you're going to be okay. Here's what practicing God's presence in the storm means. It means there will be times when you do not hear him, you do not see him, and everything that's going on in life points to the fact that he has abandoned your boat. But you have a calm assurance from the word that God is with you. Are you meditating on God's word? Or has the storm driven you away from the pages of Scripture? Have the winds and high waves spun you away from your disciplined hour, 30 minutes of prayer time on your knees every day? Have you lost sight of the fact that God is alive? You practice the presence of God by refusing to gripe and be negative. Paul's not acting like a victim here. And you do that by preaching the presence verses to yourself. There's a ton of presence verses in the Bible where God's saying, I'm going to be with you, I'll never forsake you. Just make a list of those. Meditate on those. Eat those for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. There's an old hymn entitled Christ in the Vessel. It goes like this. Begone unbelief, my Savior is near, and for my relief will surely appear. In prayer I will wrestle, and he will perform. With Christ in the vessel, I smile at the storm. God is your anchor, and that anchor will hold. The benefits of Christianity is not the absence of storms. It's the presence of God in the midst of storms. Anchor number 2. I belong to God, and God belongs to me. Chapter 27, verse 23. For this very night there stood before me an angel. Paul is speaking to the 276 people on the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I worship. Now notice the sentence structure. He doesn't belong to the angel, he belongs to God. And he said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you." Do storms bring out that confidence in you? To whom do I belong? That's covenant language. A trip that should have taken 2 to 3 weeks ends up taking 7 months. Why? We're not told. We have every reason to believe that Paul was not told why either. Maybe one of the greatest developments of your faith and mine is that while we're in the midst of a raging storm, we still muster up the courage to look people in the eye and say, the God who created these storms, these waves, and this wind is my God. I belong to him, and he belongs to me. Now, I don't know if you caught it, but twice already I've said that Satan sends storms, and then I've said God sends storms. So like, which one sends storms? I want you to see that the focus of this chapter has nothing to do with why shipwrecks are allowed by God or who causes storms to enter into our lives. But it does focus, however, on the believer's response. Can we respond like Job, who after a hurricane killed all of his children? Job said, "Though you slay me, yet I will praise you." In this passage, Paul is shouting. Paul shouts above the howling storm and the crashing waves, "My God is alive. I belong to him. He belongs to me." That truth is bigger than any storm. It will anchor you. There's an old hymn by William Cooper. Looks like Cowper. It's actually pronounced Cooper. The hymn title is "God Moves in a Mysterious Way." It goes like this: God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. So let me stop there. So when the storms are over your head, and they always are, they're under his feet. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, and trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. I belong to God, and he belongs to me. Anchor number 3. I believe what God says will happen, will happen. As a Christian, God does not always shield you from the storm. He allows you to go through the same things everyone else goes through so that you can show them hope from within the storm. What does that look like? Demonstrating the presence of God in a storm is more powerful than calling to non-Christians from without the storm and our nice, high-perched, everything's working out fine. You see, it's on the cancer bed that you can say, my body is in pain, but my spirit is filled with hope. Because one day my God will wipe away every tear from my eye, and the pain that I am experiencing now is not even to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed to me later. It's from the graveside of a child, or in the midst of years of not being able to be pregnant, that you can say, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all of his benefits, who heals all my diseases and forgives all my sins and redeems my life from the pit, who crowns me with steadfast love and mercy and satisfies me with good." It's when you're treated wrongly, when you've been forgotten about or fired for doing the right thing, that you can proclaim in front of others in the exact same situation, "Though my father and mother have forgotten me, you, Lord, will take me in. You have lifted up my head above all my enemies." But maybe you're in a storm and you're in a situation because you've messed up. It's because of your sin. You've made mistakes. It's when you're broken by sin that you can proclaim the sweetness of God's forgiveness and the healing power of his grace. Don't buy into the lie that you need a perfect life to share the gospel. Share from the storm. Storms provide the best platform for your testimony because you are put on the earth to demonstrate the graciousness of God, not your awesomeness. Anchor number 4. I am responsible, but God is in control. I see here in this story human responsibility and divine sovereignty. Keller pointed out this paradox, and it stunned me. Paul said, the boat will be destroyed, and unless everyone stays in the boat, you will die. Paradox. The sailors were actually in the text acting like they were dropping an anchor, but they were actually dropping a dinghy off the side of the boat. This little short boat, it looks like a duck, and they were trying to escape. Get rid of this, leave all them there. And Paul says, the boat will crumble, but you will survive if you stay in the boat. Verse 24 and 31. You see the problem? Because in our minds, if God is totally in charge, then our choices don't matter. Or on the flip side, if our choices have consequences, God is not in control. But both are wrong. We must get to these two places. Number one, you can't mess up God's plan for your life. Number two, God is in charge, yet what you do has real consequences. You see it later in the passage where Paul looks at the men and he says, God told me you're going to be fine. But dude, you've got to eat. Divine sovereignty, human responsibility. It reminds me of Nehemiah's day. Pray that God will protect you and put a guy on a wall with a sword. Well, wait a minute. You said pray that God will protect us. He will, by putting a guy on a wall with a sword. So I want you to know, it matters how you spend your money. It matters who you choose to marry. It has consequences. It matters what you look at on a computer screen. It matters that you work at and be very disciplined at being holy. That's human responsibility. But then there's divine sovereignty. Even the worst storms cannot derail the plan of God for your life. In other words, if God wants you to go to Rome, buy a ticket and buckle up. Friend, you are going to Rome. God has given us this crazy story to show us that no matter how crazy our lives become, it will turn out exactly as God intended. Now that can turn you into a fatalist or the happiest person in the world. Let it do the latter. Anchor number 5. There is a big storm that you do deserve. Here's what I want to do. I want to look at the biblical theology of storms before we jump into chapter 28. Let's look at all the storms in the Bible. When I think about the Bible, I think about the Old Testament. The biggest storm in the Old Testament would be Jonah. That's a big old storm. And the biggest storm in the New Testament would probably be Jesus with his disciples in Mark chapter 4. They're scared it's going to go down. Jesus is sleeping in the boat. He's got his headphones on. He's just out. They're like, wake up, moving the headphones, wake up. And Jesus says, peace be still, calms the storm. In order for us to understand this storm, we must put it in light of those two storms. So I have a chart because I'm feeling generous today. Everybody leaves with a chart. You leave with a chart. You leave with a chart. Everybody leaves with a chart. All right, here's the chart. Let's compare Jonah and Jesus in Mark 4. Jonah is in a boat. Jesus in Mark 4 is in a boat. Jonah is overtaken by a storm. Jesus is overtaken by a storm. Both descriptions of the storms, they're almost identical. Jonah was asleep in a ship. Jesus was asleep in a ship. The crew woke both of them up and said, look, we're going to die. In the Jonah story, a miracle calms the storm, threw that brother overboard. In the Jesus story, a miracle calms the storm. Peace, be still. In the Jonah story, after the miracle, the crew members are more afraid than before. In the Jesus story, after the miracle, the crew members are more afraid than before. Two almost identical stories with just one difference. In the midst of the storm, Jonah effectively said to the crew, there's only one thing to do. If I perish, you survive. If I die, you live. And they threw him into the sea, which doesn't happen in Mark's story. Or does it? In Matthew's gospel, Jesus says, one greater than Jonah is here. He's referring to himself. He says, I am the true Jonah. And he meant by this, someday I am going to calm all storms and still all waves. I'm going to destroy, destruction, break, brokenness, and kill death. How can he do that? We must put this storm into the context of all the other storms in the Bible. A mightier storm is brewing all throughout this book. And it's the storm of God's wrath. Jesus can only calm that storm because he was on a cross. And when he was on that cross, he was thrown into the ultimate storm, the ultimate waves, the waves of sin and death. Jesus was thrown into the only storm that can actually sink us, the storm of eternal justice. And that storm wasn't calmed, not until it swept Jesus away. Jesus went through the storm of God's wrath for you. There are a lot of lesser storms, but I want you to know they're temporary. This storm is eternal. And to be redeemed by the precious blood of the Lamb, there's nothing like knowing that you will never face a storm of God's wrath. It's pretty amazing. Now, I brought a second map. Let's throw up the second map. Everyone on the boat saw an island. And they were probably thinking, hey, look out there. I see land. You're seeing things. No, I see land. They're thinking this could be Gilligan's Island. So they made a push for it. They ran up on a sandbar before they hit the island, and the waves began to destroy the back of the ship. And the soldiers said, let's kill all the prisoners. They said that because according to Roman law, if a prisoner escaped under your command, you would die. And they didn't want that to happen. So they said, let's line them up, walk them off the plank. But then someone stepped in to save the day in chapter 27, verse 43. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out the plan, and he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make it for land. Now, how many of you would do that? Like you're gonna jump over. You've got some good swimming skills. I couldn't do it. I'm gonna need some floaties, some arm floaties. I can't do it. And the rest of them, this is where I would be, on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. I mean, can you imagine 276 heads just bobbing in the water? They're going to make it. They swim to shore on the Malta Island. It's not Phoenix, but it'll do. They're just glad to be alive. And they winter there for 3 months. A little island, which is barely 17 miles long. It will hold some fascinating adventures for Paul, and it will reveal some surprising things for us. It opens up, chapter 28, with 2 miracles. Here's the first island miracle. Everyone makes it safely to the shore, just like God had promised. They're cold and wet. It begins to rain. They see a fire on a beach, and it turns out the natives of the island prepared it. And the text says that the natives showed them unusual kindness, which in the Greek, if you study that out, it means they had them s'mores and hot chocolate. Come on over here. What's the big blanket that you put on? Like the snuggle, you know what I'm talking about? Snuggies. They had snuggies for everyone there. It's in the Greek. You can't see it in the English. Look, while most people were by the large barn fire singing Kumbaya, Paul was gathering sticks. Just a man of character. Gathering sticks, throws the sticks on the fire. A viper jumps out, bites Paul, and he just shakes it off. I heard a pastor preach a message on this one time entitled Shake It Off. And he said, look, when bad things come into your life, just shake it off. And when someone says something about you at work, just shake it off. Man, the people loved it. They were saying amen. They were shouting. I kept asking myself, is that the point of the text? Was that the purpose that God allowed Paul to shake off the snake? Did it have anything to do with Paul's apostolic power? He didn't answer because I was just asking myself, so, he wouldn't answer. Anyway, I think Dr. Luke probably rushed to Paul's side and said, Paul, are you all right? Let me look at your hand. Is it swelling? It's not swelling. This is so unusual. Are you in pain? Paul's like, I'm not in any pain. Luke says, that's amazing. At first, these islanders thought that he was a murderer, and this snake was judgment from the island gods. They waited for him to swell up and die, but he didn't die. So when he didn't die, they said he's a god. So for the next 3 months, Paul just unpacked to them the true God. That's the first island miracle. The second island miracle, there was an island chief named Publius. He took the crew in, entertained them for 3 days. Now you can imagine, this guy had a beachfront property, probably a large house, to house 276 people for 3 days. This whole island practiced hospitality. We could learn a lot from them. The chief's father was sick. One scholar diagnoses the sickness as Malta fever, which is long common in Malta, Gibraltar, and other Mediterranean locales. It was similar to malaria. And apparently the microorganism which causes it was identified in 1887 and traced to the milk of the Maltese goats that lived on the island. That's a historical fact for you right there. The fever it produced would last from 4 months to 3 years, sometimes resulting in death. What about with this guy? Paul just prayed over him and he healed him. It's a miracle. Finally, after 3 months, they're healing lots of people. Lots of people come into Christ, I'm sure. Finally, they leave the island and they enter onto the third ship, another Alexandrian ship. Now, this ship had decorative carvings of twins. They were mythological twins coming off the bow of the ship, Castor and Pollux. They were actually gods of navigation. And notice Paul just jumps on the ship and he doesn't hesitate. He's not protesting about the two gods on the boat. He's just saying, look, I'm going to be salt and light, and I'm going to go. So he jumps on the boat. They sail to Syracuse. You see that for 3 days, probably to spend some time with Jim Boheim and the Orangemen. It's a tough crowd. All right, tough crowd. Finally, Paul makes it to Rome in verse 14. 2.5 years earlier, God promised, Paul, you're going to make it to Rome. You're going to get there safely. Now, Rome was not known for art. Not a lot of artistic people in Rome. Didn't see a lot of people wearing skinny jeans there. Rome was known for engineering, arches, aqueducts, bridges, and roads. And their roads lasted, not like our roads. Every 2 years, you need a new road. You can still drive on their roads. While in Rome, he has some friends that come and walk beside him, give him some food, some drink, some music to listen to. They spend some time. I'm sure it was good for him to have some welcoming faces. Paul spent 2 years imprisoned in Rome. But don't think like cold, dark dungeon under the ground. This was more like house arrest, sort of like Martha Stewart was on at one time. An ankle bracelet, but can still enjoy the company of friends. And he was kept under guard for 24 hours, chained to a guard, and there would be 6 guards a day. So, that had to be a terrible assignment. Hey, we're going to chain you to this Paul. Wherever he wants to go, you have to follow him. He must have done something terrible at work, right? That's like school traffic duty. You're gonna go and you're gonna direct traffic at the school. Well, day and night for 2 years, these guards heard the gospel. And I know that because of verse 23. Notice it says Paul expounded. Paul was an expositor. You say, Colin, what is exposition? Well, Paul was an expositor. He did exposition. Exposition is reading the text, explaining the text, and then applying the text. Read, explain, apply. Or you could look at it like this. The vibe of the text is the vibe of the sermon. And so what did he expound? Notice verse 23 and 24. He expounded Moses and the prophets. Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible. The prophets, the rest of the Old Testament. So he preaches the whole Old Testament. And look, he did it in 2 years. He didn't take 2 years for each book. Also in those 2 years, he wrote Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon, what we call the prison epistles. And when you get to the end of Acts, it's a little irritating, just to be honest with you. You're wondering, what happens to Paul? It's just an unusual manner in which the book ends. What happened when Paul went to court? Does Paul ever make it to Spain? Acts doesn't tell us. It's a cliffhanger. Acts never ends. If it were a movie, it'd say to be continued. I don't like cliffhangers. That's why I have Netflix. Just watch the whole season. Avoid all the cliffhangers. But here we've got a cliffhanger. It's a little annoying to me, honestly. Until I discovered that the purpose of Acts is not to be a biography of Paul. The story of Paul was cut short, but the story of the risen Christ goes on. The gospel advances. That's the message of this book. The gospel advances through persecution, snake bites, shipwrecks, life wrecks. The gospel marches on. I want to leave you with 3 applications. Here's the first. Like Paul, your life is a series of intersections with people you don't know. So what are you going to do with these intersections? Our tendency, especially for those of you that are introverts, is to punch the gas and get away as soon as possible. Well, why not linger around and give that person some of your time? I think we just travel too fast through life. I travel too fast all the time. Actually, I get speeding tickets all the time. I can't get out of any more speeding tickets in Kentucky, North Carolina, or Tennessee. The next one's going to stick. So I've slowed it down. But here's what I believe. The pace at which we live is a hindrance to gospel impact in people's lives. Let me say that again. The pace at which we live is a hindrance to gospel impact in people's lives. We've got to find ways to slow it down. You can't do drive-by evangelism. One pastor was teaching evangelism class. Here's what he said. He was saying, look, you need to get in the car. You need to drive this certain speed, and then make sure the wind is blowing at this certain rate. And then once you get to this particular corner, roll your window down to just this certain amount, take your gospel track and let it fly. And he had this whole formula to where it would land right at the foot of someone else. Drive-by evangelism. Look, I'm proposing a different way. Let's just meet some people, right? And talk to them. And say, look, I've been redeemed by the precious blood of the Lamb. They say, I think that's crazy. Say, well, can I just walk through that with you? If you're too busy to engage people, to engage new people, you're just too busy. And I know that because of Jesus and Paul. Paul had enough time. He was the busiest man in the world at the time. And Jesus was a little busy saving the world from our sin, and he still had time to spend with people. Some of you work really hard to turn your kids into sports fans, like Tennessee fans. You even buy little onesies for your children. It has Tennessee Volunteers on it, and on the back, it's a message that says, my parents wanted me to be the laughing stock of sports. You have that. My plea is work just as hard at evangelism. Talk to friends about sin. An engineer who would not report a building is unsafe is not a real friend. A doctor who refuses to share a bad diagnosis, a software developer who refuses to report a bug, an inspector ignoring the cracks in a bridge. Turning a blind eye to sin is never heroic. Real friends talk to other friends about sin, whether they're believers or not believers. So just take risk in your invitations. Like even this week, that neighbor that you're thinking, they're never going to go to church. Take risk and invite them. That'll do two things. It will strengthen your faith if they come, and it will give God an opportunity to do a miracle just right before your eyes. Next Sunday's a perfect Sunday. I'm preaching through Hosea, all in one book because I like to torture myself. All in one sermon. It's Hosea right there. We're going to talk about couples. This would be an excellent opportunity to say, hey, this is kind of like a marriage Sunday at our church. We'd love for you to come and hear it. And if they're single, you can invite single people too, because I'm going to talk about how God promises single adults better blessings than sons and daughters. So if they're married, if they're single, as long as they're breathing, bring them on. All right? Application number 2. Like Paul, you should be concerned about unreached people groups. If there was a banner hanging over Paul's life, it would be unreached people groups. People that have little or no access to the gospel, people that have never heard the name Jesus. Paul wanted to go to Spain. Why? To play soccer? To play football? We know what real football is. It's not soccer, right? No, he wanted to go there because they were unreached. There are about 6,600, depending on who you ask, about 6,600 unreached people groups today. I want you to think about this. In Paul's day, there were 12 UPGs, unreached people groups, 12 UPGs for every one church. So what I read this week from one scholar. 12 UPGs for every one church. Today, there's one UPG for every 680 churches in the United States alone. It can be accomplished. One of my goals for this church is that there would be a particular unreached people group, and we don't have clarity on it yet. I've been praying about that for over a year. There would be one unreached people group that will become reached because of this church. Sending money, sending people, getting the word translated into that language. And I think that would be a success. Yeah, it would be a tremendous success. There would be no UPGs if every church in the state of Kentucky did that, especially if every church in the state of Tennessee did that. There would be no more people who have never heard the name Jesus. So let's just be concerned about unreached people groups. Number 3, application number 3. Like Paul, you will die. I want to end it on a high note today, okay? We know from history that Paul waited for his accusers to come with papers while he was in Rome, but they never did. So he was released. And he went to Spain to reach a UPG, was rearrested, brought back to Rome, eventually beheaded. But Paul was not afraid of death. And that shakes some of you that are not Christians. And you're like, Kyle, I'm not afraid of getting shot. I'm not afraid of any bar fight. I'm not afraid of my mama. A little bit, my mama, but I'm not afraid of anything. But if I'm going to be straight honest with you, I've got a little fear of death. But if I'll be honest with you, I had a major fear of death before I came to Christ. I would dream about death. I would dream that I died and went to hell. And I'd wake up in sweats, like my whole body's just sweating. But I have no fear of death anymore because I know that Jesus has conquered it on my behalf. I can actually taunt death. And you can too if you're a believer. Paul has a death taunt. He says, death, where is your sting? Grave, where is your victory? We don't fear death because, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, death is a festival on the road to freedom. We're going to freedom. In C.S. Lewis's Narnia, at the end of the last battle, Lewis draws this conclusion about the children's adventures in Narnia and about the reality of life on earth. And I think this is going to help us give a perspective to Paul's life, filled with suffering, and give a perspective on our life to show how long life is in comparison to eternity. Here's what it says. All of their life in this world and all their adventures had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last, they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. If you have friends or family that's gone on to be with the Lord, they've opened up chapter 1, and it's better than they could have ever imagined. All of us, if you're still breathing, man, we're still at the cover and the title page. The best is yet to come.